And one of the challenges we faced in Africa, if you were to go onto Google, for example, and typed in the term machine tools, beyond South Africa and maybe Egypt, you're not going to get any hits. You know, if you have a society that doesn't make the machines that we're sitting on, we're here in this conference room, and I would like to pose it to the audience. How many of the things that we're sitting on, that we're using, were made in this continent? And if they weren't made in this continent, how can we be talking about innovation? And if we have policymakers, people in education that don't understand that the computer that I'm using, the microphone I'm speaking into, the glasses that I wear aren't made in this continent, we haven't even started. The American president recognized that in his inaugural speech. And this is the most advanced society in the world. And he was essentially saying, particularly in the light of the financial crisis, that Americans have to go back to what really matters. That you can't speculate with property, you can't sell houses and create wealth if you're moving funds from one place to the other. You have to do what is the basis of wealth itself, be it creating software, be it creating cars, and so forth. So, okay, this slide didn't work as I wanted it to, but essentially what I have on stage is a vegetable, we have the machine, we have olive oil, and we have a machine press. You know, as David spoke to earlier, you know, we have this ludicrous situation in Africa where cashews are picked in Guinea-Bissau and roasted in India. We have diamonds being mined in Botswana and Namibia, and they're cut in India. And, you know, I just want to ask ourselves, you know, 50, 60 years after independence, how can we say that we're even talking about innovation when the most basic things aren't even being done in this part of the world? And fortunately, though, we are seeing glimpses of innovation in areas like cell phones and mobile phones. But it's not enough. You know, I was in a conference a year ago, or 2 years ago, I'm not going to mention where it was, and I said it's good enough, it's great for us to have the cell phones where we're coding the mobile applications and everything else, but it's just as important, it's equally important that we also make the phones themselves, that we code the software on the chips themselves, because if you don't do that, as a number of people have spoken to in places like MIT, if a society cedes its ability to make things, it loses many things in the process. It's a very sort of holistic environment that we cannot avoid. And people then ask me, for example, well, how do we go about doing it? And it's happening. Another thing I think it's important we point out is that as much as I'm in admiration of Silicon Valley, Route 128 in Massachusetts, Silicon Glen in Cambridge, you know, we tend to overlook our own existing areas of innovation that might not be as sexy as we would want them to be. In Ghana, you have places like Swame Magazine. In Nigeria, you have places like Nnewi. In Kenya, you have various Jua Kalis, where they might not have the same sophistication of the areas I mentioned earlier on, but ultimately, those areas with the input from more, will I say, sophisticated places, depending on how you define sophistication, could form the substrate for the kind of more holistic innovation that we need in the continent. And what I have on screen is an example of that. You know, you get the blacksmith and apply that, that knowledge with the person who uses the machine tools, and then ultimately, after a period of time, you get the robotic source of equipment. People might ask, well, what are you talking about? But that's what happened in Germany. That's what happened in every industrial society. They didn't go from, as David pointed earlier on, we're going to have policy papers on innovation, then tomorrow everyone starts making robots. It was a fusing of what we already had, recognizing it for its importance, be it in any of those three what I like to call informal industrial clusters that we have in almost every urban environment in Africa, and fusing them with what comes from outside that may speak to what we're lacking in. The quote I have on stage is a book written by a young man out of Brown University, where he spent about 3 months in a jua kali in Kenya, a number of jua kalis in Kenya. And it was interesting for me to see an outsider come into Nairobi and go to these small-scale tinkering manufacturing plants and recognize the level of sophistication and innovation that was taking place on the ground in Nairobi. Meanwhile, I would ask how many policymakers in Nairobi had actually been there. So I think we already have the people. The people exist here. Some of us exist outside the continent. The spaces exist here as well. The tools exist everywhere. But we have to tap into them because they are emerging on their own. They don't need to be, we don't need to dictate it. It doesn't need to come from the top to the bottom. It has to come from the top in terms of policy, as Ida spoke, but we also need to recognize what is happening on the bottom and create an environment where they sort of work together, or nurture an environment where they work together. I have a quote up here. The slide is a bit messed up, but I use the term fractal manufacturing to speak to the fact that we don't necessarily need to go the route that the Indians, the Chinese, the Germans, and the Swiss did directly. We don't need to mimic it. We need to look at what is already working in some of the clusters I was referring to and ask ourselves, how can we improve them? I believe, and many other people believe, that we need to look at the formal sector, we need to look at the informal sector, we need to ask ourselves, how can we get them to work together? The researchers and the scientists need to work with the artisans and sort of tinkerers that you were speaking to in terms of garage research and otherwise. And it's that manufacturing class, that production class that exists, if we recognize it for what it is, we'll be in a position where what we see happening in areas of the cell phone world and the mobile application world will also happen in these other critical areas across the continent. The last slide I have on stage is essentially speaking to the fact that we already see this happening in the mobile application development space. I would like to see it happen in all these other spaces where we're not meeting up. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emeka. Now, before we switch over to Prof. Emeka, there are two things I'm just going to share with you and get your thoughts on. First of all, I think it's interesting that you mentioned Botswana and the production of raw uncut diamonds. I was in Botswana in 2009 when they just opened up the Diamond Hub, which is basically a center for the processing of diamonds. Fast forward to this year, and De Beers, the biggest diamond company in the world, has relocated its head office to Gaborone. And as I was there, they were training Botswanans on how to cut diamonds. And I spoke to the head of the Diamond Hub, and he said basically the argument is we're a small country, we produce a lot of diamonds, we must train our people on how to cut diamonds, because whereas we're getting, say, $3 billion from exporting, it's a $50, $60 billion business. So some countries are doing better than others. But Prof, before I come to your question, what I want to ask Emeka is this. You talk about being a maker of things and the need to be a maker of things. And you used a lot of technical terms, manufacturing. And let's be blunt. There are many who will point out that across Africa, the economic policy is driven by trade and export of raw materials and not by a policy of industrialization. In fact, it's almost derided as something that Africa does not need. How do you break that straitjacket, which is driven largely by, I would just say, international lending organizations?
I think that we typically have this conversation where, for example, if you look at the textile industry in South Africa, and there was a conversation a few years ago where, and I'm getting to your question, but I wanted to provide some context here. There was some conversation as to, and I don't want it to sound somehow on the, to the extent that Chinese textile imports were wrecking textile industries across Africa. But my question to people, well, Vietnam is right next to China. They share a border with the Chinese, and they found a way to compete with them. And I feel that it's an excuse, it's a lame excuse for African individuals, be them policymakers, industrialists, or others, to say that because of existing arrangements, that we are not in a position to capitalize on some of the advantages we have. You pointed out Botswana. Up until 6 years ago, Botswana didn't have a diamond cutting industry, but there was a decision made where they said, well, no, we can learn how to cut diamonds. We can learn to manufacture just as effectively as everyone else. Because if that argument were to be used, then the only industrial power in the world would be England. Because when the English, and I believe they were the first industrialized country, and I may be wrong on that, they wanted to stop the French, the Germans, and everyone else from learning how to weave cloth. So if the rest of Europe was able to do that, and East Asia is doing that, and China and India is, I don't think we have any excuse to say that we couldn't if we looked at what we were good at. And in the example of Botswana that you gave, they picked the low-hanging fruit. Every African country has its own low-hanging fruit. And that's one of the ways I'd answer that question.
Thank you very much, Emeka. Oh, now, Professor Gurib Fakim Amina, you have...
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to be here, to be presenting an area which has kept my attention for the past 20 years at least, and I hope for 20 more. Keep going. So when I was given the title, I wanted to focus on biodiversity. And so I've literally tweaked a bit the title to precisely address the potential and the prospects for Africa. So I will talk about the innovation for the sustainable management of biodiversity. So just to quickly explain my background, because I think this is important in the case of the discussion, I have been until 2011 an academic with training as a chemist, and I have taken 2 years off my post as an academic to start this adventure of creating this company in order to take on the research I've been doing at university and now to apply it with all the innovative issues that we have been discussing today, to see how we can add value to the biodiversity. And I shall home in eventually to one area which has been of interest to me, which is the field of medicinal and herbal medicine. So I'll just quickly give a brief overview of what I'm talking about. So we'll talk about the people and plant, the symbiotic relationship, the big picture of medicinal plant, conservation and sustainable use, which is very important, drug discovery, and I shall lead on to the creation of the Center for Phytotherapy Research, which I'm talking about, and the new agenda for sustainability, because this is an area which has been there since 1992 with Rio, which is coming back again, Rio Plus 20 in a few months' time, and we are increasingly talking about the green economy, so we will not be able to do that until we address this area of sustainability.